Today we will explore a distant era, prior to newspapers, radio, television, and social networks, when medieval Europe already possessed its own figures capable of shaping opinions, disseminating ideas, and influencing behaviors through means that have survived time. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this. Imagine a society where most people did not know how to read, where information traveled slowly, carried by travelers who traversed dusty roads between distant villages and cities, where news from neighboring kingdoms arrived weeks or months after happening. In this seemingly isolated world, there existed extraordinary figures who occupied a central role in communication between people. Through music, poetry, humor, and satire, they connected worlds separated by distances that seemed insurmountable. Their voices echoed in majestic castles and busy squares, reaching from the most powerful nobles to the humblest peasants. We are facing a fascinating time, a time when the sung word had the power to cross borders, a time when a well-placed joke could change the course of political decisions, a time when stories told around fires shaped the way entire communities understood the world around them. This is the story of the troubadours, the jesters, and the minstrels, the great communicators of the Middle Ages. To understand the importance of these artists, we first need to dive into the context in which they lived. Medieval Europe, especially between the 11th and 14th centuries, was a mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, and lordships, frequently in conflict. The Catholic Church exercised enormous influence over daily life, and society was rigidly divided between those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked the land. In this seemingly static scenario, a cultural phenomenon emerged that would profoundly transform social relations and the way people expressed their most intimate feelings. In the south of France, in a region known as Occitania, a poetic tradition flourished that would forever change the history of European literature. The troubadours, as they became known, were poet-musicians who composed and performed their own songs in aristocratic courts. The term comes from the Provençal troubar, which means to find or to invent. A troubadour was, therefore, someone who invented new poetic forms, finding original verses for their elaborate love lyrics. The oldest troubadour whose works have survived to our day was William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, who lived between the years 1071 and 1126. His position as duke ensured that his name was preserved by history, but scholars believe that his songs represented not the beginning of a tradition, but rather the pinnacle of already established poetic practices. There is evidence that other composers, whose names have been lost in time, were already practicing similar forms of sung poetry before him. The art of the troubadours had a fundamental characteristic that distinguished it from previous literary production. They composed in the vernacular language, specifically in Occitan and not in Latin, the official language of the church and scholarship. This choice was not accidental. By using the language spoken daily by the local nobility, the troubadours made their art emotionally accessible and culturally resonant. Their words touched the hearts of those who heard them in a way that ecclesiastical Latin never could. The themes explored by these poets were varied, but one of them stood out above all others. Courtly love, as it was later known, was an idealized form of romantic expression that emphasized devotion, restraint, and emotional refinement. In this model, the knight devoted himself entirely to the lady of his choice, often a married woman, and therefore inaccessible. The impossibility of consummation made this love even purer and more elevated in the eyes of courtly society. This romantic conception represented a true revolution in the customs of the time. Before the troubadours, aristocratic marriages were political and economic arrangements in which the woman functioned as a bargaining chip in transactions involving land and power. Affection between spouses was, at best, a happy consequence, but rarely an expectation. The troubadours, by celebrating love, freely chosen and based on mutual admiration, offered a radical alternative to this model. Bernard de Ventadorn was one of the most celebrated troubadours of the 12th century. Son of a servant at the castle of Ventadorn, he rose socially through his extraordinary poetic talent. His songs won hearts throughout Europe, and he even frequented the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of her time. The granddaughter of William Knive himself, Eleanor was an enthusiastic patron of the arts and surrounded herself with poets and musicians throughout her life. The influence of Eleanor of Aquitaine in the propagation of troubadour culture cannot be underestimated. Married first to King Louis VII of France and then to Henry II of England, she took with her the taste for courtly poetry wherever she went. When she separated from Henry and established her own court in Poitiers around 1170, she created an environment extraordinarily favorable to the arts. Some historians suggest that her daughter Marie, Countess of Champagne, presided over the so-called courts of love, where questions of romantic etiquette were debated as if they were legal cases. Andreas Capellanus, a cleric who served in the court of Marie of Champagne, wrote around 1184 a treatise known as The Art of Courtly Love. In this text, he codified the rules and conventions of the romantic behavior idealized by the troubadours. Although the tone of the treatise suggests a dose of irony and veiled criticism, it documents the practices and expectations of the aristocracy of the time regarding love and the relationship between men and women. The troubadours were not limited to romantic themes. Many composed songs that praised their patrons, subtly reinforcing political alliances and reputations. Others criticized rivals, mocked moral hypocrisy, or reflected on war, exile, and injustice. The alba, for example, was a genre of song that depicted the parting of lovers at dawn, with a watchman warning of the arrival of day and the danger of being discovered. The pastorella told the story of a knight courting a shepherdess, often with comic results. The tenso was a poetic dispute between two troubadours on questions of love or morality. The music that accompanied these poems was monophonic, consisting only of a melody without harmonization. Often, the melody was not composed by the poet himself. There are records that Rimbaud de Vaqueras wrote his famous poem Calenda Maya, using a dance melody he had heard in Montferrat. This practice of musical borrowing was common and accepted at the time. The troubadour tradition did not remain confined to the south of redirection. It spread to the north, where the troubadours were called trouvères and composed in Old French. In Germany, the Minnesänger emerged, whose name means singers of love. In the Iberian Peninsula, Galician Portuguese lyric poetry flourished with its own characteristics. In Sicily and northern Italy, the tradition influenced poets who would later be recognized as precursors of the Renaissance, including Dante Alighieri and Francesco Petrarch. The decline of the troubadour tradition began at the end of the 13th century, accelerated by traumatic events such as the Albigensian Crusade, which devastated Occitania between 1209 and 1229. This military campaign, launched by the Catholic Church against the Cathar heresy, destroyed the social fabric that sustained the courtly culture of southern France. Many troubadours fled to other kingdoms, and the Occitan language gradually lost its prestige. But the ideas they had propagated had already taken deep root in European culture, influencing literature, social expectations, and even conceptions of marriage and gender relations for centuries to come. While the troubadours shaped ideals through beauty and emotion, another figure exercised their influence through completely different means. The court jester occupied a unique and paradoxical position in medieval society, socially marginal, yet extraordinarily protected. His role as a fool granted him a freedom of expression denied to practically all other members of the court. The tradition of the jester was much older than the Middle Ages themselves. Egyptian records dating back more than 2,000 years before the Common Era already mention entertainers who amused the pharaohs. The Romans appreciated their comic actors, known as ballatrones, whose frankness sometimes cost them imperial persecution. When these comedians fled Rome to escape censorship, they spread across Europe, planting seeds that would germinate centuries later in the form of medieval jesters. During the Middle Ages, two distinct categories of jesters emerged. The so-called natural fools were individuals with intellectual or physical disabilities who were kept by noble families as a kind of curious diversion. Popular belief considered them closer to God and therefore bearers of an innocent truth. Their lack of social awareness and their direct frankness were tolerated and even appreciated by the powerful in contexts where anyone else would be accused of treason for saying the same words. The licensed fools, on the other hand, were highly trained professional artists. They mastered a wide range of skills: comedy, music, juggling, acrobatics, mime, magic, and storytelling. Their sharp intelligence and quick thinking were their main tools of the trade. They needed to constantly improve and expand their repertoire to maintain the interest of their patrons at the risk of being replaced by more innovative artists. The typical clothing we associate with jesters, with pointed hats adorned with bells and multicolored clothes, developed gradually over the centuries. The marotte, a wooden scepter decorated with a face that resembled the jester himself, became a characteristic symbol of his function in the court. The power of the jester resided in his ability to tell truths that no one else dared to utter. Through jokes, riddles, parodies, and exaggerated performances, he could criticize nobles, expose arrogance, and comment on political decisions. What could not be said directly could often be said safely through laughter. There was something almost sacred in this function. The jester functioned as an escape valve for social tensions that might otherwise explode in more destructive ways. A famous case perfectly illustrates this role. In 1340, when the French fleet was crushed by the English navy at the Battle of Sluys, King Philip VI needed to be informed of the disaster. The task fell to the court jester, who carefully considered how to convey the news. He told the king that the English soldiers did not even have the courage to jump into the water like the brave Frenchmen. With this seemingly complimentary comment, the jester conveyed the devastating truth that the French fleet had been destroyed, without putting his own head at risk. Will Sommers was one of the most famous jesters in English history. He served King Henry VIII during the turbulent years of his reign, being one of the few people capable of making the monarch smile when he suffered from the pain of his ulcerated leg. Sommers and the king practiced verse games, in which Henry would provide the first line of a poem, and Sommers would respond with a funny, rhyming second line. The jester even joked about the king's many wives, a subject that would have cost anyone else their head. But Sommers was not just a comedian. He showed tact in matters of state, offering advice to the king when necessary. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, supposedly used him to influence the monarch on various issues. Sommers' privileged position next to the king also allowed him to help members of his own family. When his uncle faced financial ruin, the jester managed to negotiate a favorable deal with the king himself. Women also exercised the function of jesters, although in smaller numbers. Jane Fool served in the English court during the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Mary I. She was frequently presented with fine clothes by her mistress Anne Boleyn and was considered one of the best-dressed women in the court. Jesters also performed surprising functions in times of war. They rode in front of the troops, provoking and mocking the enemy to raise the morale of their own army. Their skills were used as a form of psychological warfare, disorienting and confusing opposing soldiers. They also served as messengers, carrying confidential information between battlefields and even to the enemy camp, an extremely dangerous task that often cost them their lives. Roland the Farter was a jester who served King Henry II of England in the 12th century. His particular talent was reserved for a single annual performance, the King's Christmas celebrations. The performance culminated with what Latin records describe as a simultaneous jump, a whistle, and a fart. For this singular service, Roland received an estate of 30 acres of land on the condition that he returned to court every Christmas to repeat his act. This humor, which we today consider vulgar, had deep meaning in medieval culture. Flatulence functioned as a great leveler between social classes, reminding everyone that regardless of position or power, all human beings shared the same bodily functions. Beyond the courts, minstrels and itinerant artists played an equally important role in medieval life. Traveling from town to town, they brought songs, stories, legends, and news to markets, taverns, and festivals. These performers often mixed entertainment with information, spreading accounts of battles, scandals, miracles, and famous figures. As stories were retold, They were adapted to suit local audiences, values, and expectations. This meant that the performers did not simply transmit information, they actively shaped it. The term minstrel derives from the medieval Latin ministralis paus, which means servant. Originally, the word described any kind of artist, musician, juggler, acrobat, singer, or jester. Over time, it came to designate specifically those who sang and played musical instruments. This semantic evolution reflects the increasing specialization of the performing arts throughout the Middle Ages. The life of a minstrel varied enormously depending on his social position. Those who managed to secure permanent employment in noble or royal courts enjoyed financial security, comfortable housing, and respectable status. In 1322, for example, a minstrel known as Agnes the Red received 4 shillings from King Edward II of England for a single performance, a considerable sum for the time. Minstrels employed by the nobility could accumulate significant fortunes and use their influence to benefit family and friends. The majority of minstrels, however, were composed of itinerant artists without fixed employment. These travelers depended on the gifts, clothes, and food that the public offered them. They followed established routes, performing at important fairs and markets where they could attract larger audiences. Their life was precarious and uncertain, but it offered a freedom that few other members of medieval society knew. Itinerant minstrels functioned as the journalists of their time. Since serfs were forbidden from leaving their villages, they depended on traveling artists to receive information about what was happening in the rest of the country. Minstrels brought news and gossip, the latest fashions, poetry, songs, and dances. They were the voice of change in a society that frequently resisted transformation. The ballads sung by itinerant minstrels differed from those performed by artists employed by lords. While the latter sang in Latin or French, the minstrels of the people used vernacular English. Employing simple rhymes and memorable melodies, they told stories that interested common people. Many of these ballads dealt with rebellion and resistance against oppression. The most popular character in these narratives was Robin Hood, the outlaw who stole from the rich to give to the poor. There are historical records that mention Robin Hood as early as the 14th century. Writers of the time report that, during the reign of Richard the Lionheart, the most famous thieves, Robin Hood and Little John, flourished, ambushing wealthy travelers in the forests. Ballads about their adventures were sung throughout Great Britain, transforming him into a symbol of popular resistance against the injustice of the powerful. This capacity to disseminate subversive ideas worried the authorities. In 1402, a law was passed against itinerant minstrels in Wales, accused of encouraging support for Owain Glyndwr's revolt against English rule. In 1469, another law determined that all minstrels should be evaluated by royal minstrels before being granted permission to perform for the public. These laws, however, were impossible to enforce, and itinerant minstrels remained active throughout the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church maintained an ambiguous relationship with minstrels. Although some artists participated in religious festivities, most were universally condemned by the clergy as immoral, idle, and drunken. John of Salisbury, a 12th century ecclesiastic, even argued that minstrels should be exterminated because they diverted the people from the correct path. This hostility derived partially from the fact that minstrels frequently satirized the excesses and sexual immorality of many medieval clerics, providing abundant material for tavern songs. The jongleurs were a specific category of artists who distinguished themselves from troubadours and ordinary minstrels. While troubadours composed their own poetry, jongleurs were performers who executed the works of others, traveling extensively to disseminate them. In 1321, the minstrels of Paris were organized into a professional guild. The instruments used by these artists were varied. The lute and the harp were the most prestigious in noble courts. The rebec, a precursor to the violin, was popular among minstrels of all classes. Bagpipes, flutes, and tambourines accompanied performances at fairs and festivals. What united troubadours, jesters, and minstrels was their ability to capture attention, evoke emotion, and make ideas memorable, the same qualities that define influence even today. They understood their audiences, adapted their messages, and used performance to persuade, entertain, and provoke reflection. Although they did not have digital platforms, their stages were castles, streets, and public squares, and their reach depended on human memory rather than algorithms. The influence of these artists was especially powerful among common people, for whom official documents and scholarly literature were completely inaccessible. Through their performances, they formed informal networks of information exchange that connected distant regions, introduced new cultural ideas, and reinforced shared narratives about morality, authority, and identity. In a society heavily dependent on oral communication, those who mastered the art of the spoken and sung word exercised extraordinary power. In this perspective, medieval artists were much more than background figures in history. They were shapers of culture, architects of social ideals, and subtle critics of power. Through song, satire, and storytelling, they influenced how people understood love, authority, justice, and themselves. Long before the modern concept of influence existed, these performers proved that whoever controls the story or the song holds the power to shape opinion. The troubadour tradition established standards of romantic expression and emotional depth that resonate through all Western literature to the present day. Jesters demonstrated that humor can be a form of truth, a tool to challenge power in ways that direct confrontation would never allow. Minstrels proved that information is power, and that those who disseminate it exercise disproportionate influence over how societies understand themselves and the world. Looking back through the centuries, we can recognize in ourselves the heirs of this tradition. The podcasters who tell engaging stories, the comedians who expose political hypocrisies, the musicians whose lyrics capture the spirit of their time. All of them descend in some way from those medieval artists who traveled the dusty roads of Europe with their harps and their stories. Technology has changed radically since then. Today, a message can reach millions of people in seconds, crossing continents and oceans at the speed of light. But the fundamental principles of influence remain the same. Tell a good story, make people laugh, touch their hearts, make them think, connect with their deepest experiences. These skills were valuable 1,000 years ago and continue to be valuable today. The Middle Ages teach us that influence does not depend on technology, but on humanity. It depends on the ability to understand what moves people, what makes them dream, fear, hope, and love. The troubadours understood this when they sang about impossible loves that made the hearts of the nobility sigh. The jesters understood this when they made kings laugh at their own weaknesses. The minstrels understood this when they told stories of popular heroes who resisted oppression. This is the heritage they left us. Not just poems and melodies preserved in dusty manuscripts, although these too are precious. They left us the understanding that communication is an art, and that those who master it can change the world. That entertainment can be a vehicle for transformative ideas. That laughter can be a form of resistance. That the stories we tell shape the reality in which we live. When we think of the great cultural movements of history, we often focus on kings and generals, popes and emperors. But perhaps we should pay more attention to those who sang in the shadows of thrones, who made jokes in the corridors of palaces, who told stories in village squares. For it was they who, in many ways, determined how the masses understood their world. It was they who planted seeds of change that would flourish in future revolutions. They were the true influencers of their time. And so we end our journey through this fascinating era. We visited courts where troubadours sang of elevated loves and chivalric ideals. We met jesters who told truths through jokes and elaborate performances. We followed minstrels along dusty roads as they carried news and entertainment from village to village. We discovered that, even in an era seemingly so different from ours, the fundamental principles of communication and influence remained essentially the same. If you have made it this far, it means you are also passionate about discovering the fascinating stories that the past has to tell us. Just as the troubadours needed their audience for their songs to come to life, just as the minstrels depended on their public to continue their journeys, we also need you to continue bringing these documentary narratives. If this episode touched you in some way, if it sparked your curiosity about distant eras, if it made you reflect on the surprising connections between past and present, consider subscribing to this channel. Leave your comment telling us which aspect of medieval life intrigued you the most. Share this video with someone who also enjoys diving into the depths of history. And don't forget to like, because this small gesture, just like the applause the minstrels received in medieval squares, encourages us to continue creating content with the same dedication that those artists put into their performances centuries ago. Until the next journey through the corridors of time.